There are times when it's brilliant to have people come back on me concerning things I have said in the past that need to be relooked at, reconsidered, and reworked. And this has happened in just the last few weeks. I've been doing a whole series, as you've known, on the problem with Mecca. And a number of days ago, actually about a week or two ago, I did a video on Jeddah, where I talked about the archaic history of Jeddah and how important it was, and how that it predated Mecca by centuries. And I said, it is probably one of the oldest cities on the western coast of Arabia, there on the Red Sea. One of you, named Lyth Mashni, if that is your name, has come back with a retort. And this is what Lyth Mashni says. You are just saying what's on the Wikipedia page on Jeddah, which isn't very accurate, to say the least. For one, the earliest Thamudic script is from the 8th century BC. That's well into the Iron Age. So neither you nor the person who wrote the article on Wiki know what the Stone Age is. And the thing about the oldest mashrabiyyas being pre-Islamic, the Wiki article just pulled that out of thin air. It's legitimate to question the traditional narrative, but don't just replace it with your own BS, is what he's saying. Now, thank you, Lyth Mashni. You get these and you say, whoa, wait a minute. Hold on a minute. Let me go back, because whenever I do Wikipedia, you don't know who's written it. That is true. And Lyth is saying, be careful of Wikipedia. And what I like to do is, whenever there is an article in Wikipedia that quotes, especially historical material, I like to look at where that quote comes from. I look at the footnotes, and then I follow through the footnotes. So I realized that I hadn't really done my homework on this. I was just lifting this out of Wikipedia, and I really needed to go back. So my team, and especially Dr. Pat Andrews, and I want to thank Dr. Pat Andrews especially. He's my historian. And he is one of the best I know of, who is amazing at history. And so he did an awful lot of research. And the two of us together now have unpacked what we think, where we went wrong in this. And it is to, thanks Lyth for bringing this to the fore. When you look at the article on Jeddah, you need to look and see where they got it from. And it turns out they got it from the Jeddah Municipality in Saudi Arabia. Now, you would think the municipality would know its own history. What is fascinating, it is basically just lifting this from tradition. It's what tradition says Jeddah is. It talked about the fact that it goes all the way back to the Stone Age without ever giving any proof of the Stone Age. It refers to these Thamudian writings in the Brayman and the Wadi Bob, northeast of Jeddah. But we've looked, and we cannot find any of these Thamudian writings. And I'd love to know where the Jeddah municipality got these writings from. It talks about the Saad Madib dam that it did break. And that is true. That is historical. But look where Saad Madib is. It's way down in the Hadramaut area. Here, I'll just put a picture of it. Take a look. It is hundreds of miles away, and it has nothing to do with Jeddah. There would be no reason if the dam breaks and floods the whole valley. Why would they come all the way up to Jeddah? No one, I didn't even think that through. I wasn't really paying attention to that. And then the municipality talks about, the Jeddah municipality talks about the fact that Jeddah was the place that Alexander the Great came to between 323 and 356 BC. That's the 4th century BC, that Alexander the Great came to Jeddah and that he went to Mecca. He went to Mecca to do his Hajj, as if he was a Muslim back there in the 4th century BC. Once you start getting to this, you start to scratch your head and say, hold on a minute. This is getting a little bit out of whack. Looks like they're grabbing anything they can get. They do mention that Jeddah then was created by Uthman bin Affan, who would be the 3rd caliph in 647. Now stop and think. If he created it, then how could Alexander the Great have been there in 343 BC if it wasn't created till 647 AD? So you can see there's a contradiction immediately right here with what the municipality of Jeddah has put out there. They say that the reason they know that Uthman created Jeddah is because of two individuals, Ibn Jubair from 1217 and Ibn Battuta So they're quoting both two different scholars who are from the 12th, that's the 13th century and the 14th century. So they're quoting 13th and 14th century to say what's happening back in the 7th century. Do you see a problem with that? Have you noticed this is what I've always come across? This is the difficulty I have with so many Islamic traditions. They're always quoting 9th, 10th, 11th, in this case 12th and 13th century for what they think happened back in the 7th century. And then there is another thing, another source that the Wikipedia uses, and that's from the Saudi Arabians Ministry of Hajj. Ministry of Hajj, which is the pilgrimage. It's the Ministry of Pilgrimage. This is what they said. And they declared that Jeddah is located on the west coast of Saudi Arabia, on the Red Sea, and was founded as a small fishing village more than 2,500 years ago. So that's even earlier. That's even earlier than Alexander the Great. So they're pushing it back even another 100 years, actually 200 years before Alexander the Great. And the reason it was given its name is because the name means ancestress or grandmother. And by using that word, they're saying this is therefore where Eve actually came to. When she was thrown down from heaven, she was thrown down to Jeddah, and her tomb is still there. And they have the tomb that is there. Now, in 1928, the Saudi Arabian government destroyed that tomb because of their Wahhabi leanings, I understand, because they thought it encouraged shirk, idolatry. So it no longer is there today. Nonetheless, the tradition still stands. And so this Ministry of Hajj has included that tradition in their writings. And I thank you, Lyth Mashni, for making sure that we do follow through on this. So what I decided to do, and what I asked Dr. Pat Andrews to do and help me with, is to go back and find out some good research. What research has been done on Jeddah? What research has been done on the west coast of Arabia, on the Red Sea? Because we need to unpack this. And good old Pat Andrews says, well, Jay, why don't you go back to your professor that you studied under, Dr. J.R. Halting, because he wrote about this. He wrote about the origin of Jeddah and the problem with Al-Shu'aibah, which is, many people believe could be Jeddah because it's very close. They're very close together. Today, the city incorporates both the city of Jeddah and Shu'aibah, And he wrote about this in the journal called Arabica, Tome 31, facsimile 3, in November of 1984. So he has written about this, and he did a study on it. And he confronts this idea that Alexander the Great was there. And he says that he supposedly went to Jeddah and departed from Jeddah for the Bilad al-Maghrib, coming to Mecca to accomplish his Hajj. And he confronts this head on because, he confronts this and another area, another tradition that says that the reason why the polytheism of Jahiliyyah went to monotheism of Islam was because some idols were washed up on the shore of Jeddah, and because of these idols, which were then incorporated and put into the Kaaba there in Mecca, Muhammad had to come and eradicate and destroy them. Sounds somewhat like the story of Abraham, who goes into the Kaaba in Surah 21 of the Quran and goes and destroys the idols there. So it looks like this was repeated after Abraham did it in 1900 BC. Then Muhammad does it again in his lifetime in the 7th century AD. And that was then why Muhammad brought it from the polytheism, because of these idols that had washed up on the shore of Jeddah, and brought it back to monotheism. And he confronts that, and he says almost all of this is legendary. And I quote him, and this is what he says. Alexander was not a Muslim. He was a bisexual polytheist who believed himself to be the son of Zeus Ammon. So he believed he was a god. He was intending to invade Arabia after his return from India, but died before he could do so. And then there's another reference, and this is from Don L. Gilly and Ian Worthington, called Alexander the Great, Macedonia and Asia, in Joseph Roisman and Ian Worthington's A Companion to Ancient Macedonia, put out by Oxford, Blackwell Publishing in 2010. So we're talking about 11 years ago. They go and they look at who exactly and what Alexander did. Alexander the Great was interested in Arabia. That's true. And Gilly and Worthington unpack what we now know about Alexander the Great. He did send naval expeditions to Arabia. He sent 3 naval expeditions from Babylon. Babylon is where as we now know today, is in Iraq, and it would be close to what Baghdad is, or Kufa, that area, central part of Iraq. So he already controlled that area, and so he came down to Basra, and he sent these naval expeditions from Basra. So I'm going to put it up on the map. Here is the first one, and the first one that was sent was by Archias. And Archias, went as far as the island of Titus, which is Bahrain. Now, let's put it up there. There is Bahrain today. So this is a modern map, folks. Listen, every time I'm giving you a map, I'm giving you a modern map because you won't know what these places are if I use just archaic words. But I'll put the name in there. The word would have been the island of Titus. Titus was the name back then. Today it's called Bahrain. So you can see it there on the map. And then he sent a second naval expedition under Androsthenes, who sailed to a part of the peninsula of Arabia. So let's put up that expedition. There you can see Androsthenes, and he comes down, and you can see he goes down through the Persian Gulf and comes out to the Gulf of Oman, and that's as far as he got. So that was the second expedition. A third expedition then was sent by Alexander the Great, and this third expedition was under the authority of Hieron of Soli. Arrian writes about this, and this is what Gilly and Worthing are quoting Arrian when he writes about this. And he says, Hieron had received instruction to sail around the whole Arabian Peninsula as far as the Arabian Gulf near Egypt against Hierapolis. Hierapolis would be what is today Cairo. So he was to follow. Let's look at the arrows. He goes down through the Persian Gulf, over through the Gulf of Oman, comes down to the Arabian Sea, comes over to the Gulf of Aden, goes up there through what is today Djibouti and Yemen, and he then goes up the Red Sea. That is where he sailed, Hieron of Soli. Now, then suddenly he turns back, and he doesn't go into Egypt. He just turns right around and retraces his steps. Why does he suddenly turn back? Well, let's read what Arrian says. And this is in his book Anabasis, book 7, chapter 20, pages number 7 and 8. We suppose the reason Hieron turned back before reaching the Egyptian Gulf opposite to Hierapolis, that would be up where Cairo would be today, was that the arid tract of central western Arabia, there were no inhabitant cities or harbors to give anchorage for his fleet. So in the 4th century BC, there was nothing there on the western coast of Arabia to give anchorage to his fleet. That's why he turned around and came back, because he needed to get supplies, and he could not get supplies there in what is today Arabia. This corresponds to the part of Western Arabia where Mecca was later built, a region that later Greek geographers described as uninhabitable. So that's coming out of Gilly and Worthington's book. Now let's move on. Because I want to talk a little bit more about Hawting. Hawting was my professor. I knew him. I studied under him when I was there in London back in 1994, 1995. And in his book, the book that he wrote, The Origin of Jeddah and the Problem of Shu'aibah from Arabica, that's in 1984 that I quoted earlier. Actually, it's an article that he wrote. He talks about the tradition about Eve, that Eve was at Jeddah. Those traditions, he says, associating Jeddah with Eve would be relatively late attempts to provide it with a religious significance. So he completely dismisses that and said these are all much too late. What about Uthman? He talks about the Caliph Uthman, and he says Uthman making Jeddah the port of Mecca, and he shows the map on his thing. He says when you look at these, he says the details, these traditions appear, so far as I know, that's Hawting, only in a comparative late source, that of Al-Nahrawali, who died in 1582. Look at the date, 1582. He cites as his source the Tahriq of Hafiz Najm al-Din Umar bin Fahd, whose literary activity was in the second half of the 15th century. So that would be a century earlier. And he was a pupil of Al-Fazi, the author of the Shiva. In a Shiva, however, Uthman's action is mentioned only briefly, not in the detail which Al-Nahrawali provides. And there has to be some doubt, therefore, about the source and antiquity of Nahrawali's details. Why? Mainly because it's from the 14th century. So you can see the supposed 7th century linkage of Jeddah to Mecca is based on much, much later traditions. They go all the way back to the 1500s, which is the 16th century. Much, much too late to be considered valid. So what is his conclusion? Hawting's conclusion. If there is no early evidence for either Jeddah or Mecca, does this imply that neither existed? And then he goes on in page 323 and 324. He says, Muslim sources then are of doubtful value when it comes to answering the various questions about the origins of Jeddah. Non-Muslim sources certainly provide no grounds for thinking that it existed before Islam, in spite of the general assumption in modern works that it did. Jeddah does not appear to be mentioned in any pre-Islamic source, either South Arabian or classical. This argument for silence is not in itself positive evidence, but it is striking. And here's what's interesting, and I want to show you something. I'm going to put up a map here as I'm quoting this, because he then goes on and says, it is striking that in contrast to Jeddah, we do have pre-Islamic attestation of Yanbu, or Jambia, the port of Yathrib, what is today Medina. Let's look on it. Look on the map there. You can see where Jeddah is. Look where Yanbu is, and look and see how close it is to what is today Medina. It used to be called Yathrib. So there is all kinds of support for that historically, but nothing for Jeddah. And hold on and stop and think that through. Wouldn't Mecca be more important than Yathrib? Isn't Mecca the center of history? Isn't Mecca where the Kaaba has been? Certainly since the time of Abraham in 1900 BC. It's where Adam and Eve certainly lived and were sent to. So it would be the oldest hamlet in the history of mankind. It would certainly be much more important than Yathrib, which is nothing more than a trading spot. And yet Yanbu is attested as the port city for Yathrib. There is no reference to any port city for Mecca. So Haunting is saying we need to be careful about this. Let me just finish what Haunting says. It seems, therefore, that there is no information about Al-Shuaibah or Jeddah apart from the meager details in Muslim traditions, which are much, much too late. And there is a strong impression that the Muslim scholars themselves had no real knowledge of it. So, is he the only one? Well, no. Pat Andrews then suggested I take a look at Ulrike Freitag, who just came out last year with, I'm assuming this is a woman, in her seminal work. Yes, it is a woman. Ulrike Freitag, who is a scholar, and she wrote the book called A History of Jeddah, The Gate to Mecca in the 19th and 20th Century. Notice she says the gate to Mecca in the 19th and 20th century. This is put out by Cambridge in New York, Cambridge University Press. And on page 40, she talks about this. Well, she talks about it quite a bit. I'm not going to say everything she says, but she asks this question. Why is it that Jeddah just has no historical references? Why is it nobody knows about this place called Jeddah? And she says very clearly, Jeddah had disadvantages. Fresh water had to be brought into the town as there was no spring in the vicinity. The coastal plain was only sparsely populated. So the reason why Jeddah is not famous is because hardly anybody lived there. It was only a fishing village, and it did not have any water. So if it did not have any water, you can see this is the same thing that Patricia Corona found about Mecca. Mecca doesn't have any water either. She goes on and says, if the vicinity of Jeddah was so sparse in towns of population and water, why would sailing ships come from India or China want to stop there rather than the more fertile African coast of the Red Sea? And she brings up a whole new category. What about the African coast, which is the opposite side of the Red Sea? Not the eastern coast of the Red Sea, but the western coast, the African coast. In her book, she refers to Agatharchides. Remember, we talked about Agatharchides. I referred to him earlier in one of my videos on some of the problems, because Agatharchides is the one who is the one in the 2nd century BC, refers to to Arabia. Of course, Arabia, as he knows it, is much further north. In his book, Agatharchides of Cnidus on the Erythraean Sea, translated and edited by Stanley Burstein of London, the Haklut Society in 1989. And he refers to the tribes of the Sabaeans. Agatharchides talks about the Sabaeans, who are from Saba. Well, let's see where that is on a map. Here is Saba on a map. And you can see it's very close to what is today Sana'a and Yemen. Yeah, what we know back in the 7th century as the Hadramat. She goes on and then she talks about the 1st century AD work of Pericles of the Erythraean Sea and refers to the same general area. And she quotes from Wilfred H. Slough, the Pericles of the Erythraean Sea, Travel and Trade in the Indian Ocean by the Merchants of the 1st Century, that was written by Longmans and Green in 1912. And he talks about the town of Mocha, Musa, modern day Mocha. Musa would be in the Yemen, and that they refer to all the material that comes out of Mocha, all of the enormous amount of blankets, cloaks, sweet rush, saffron. Talks about different colors of sashes, ointments, moderate quantity of wine, wheat, and all of this material that's coming out of Mocha. Take a look where Mocha is on the map. It's very close to Safa. In fact, it's right there at the Gulf of Aden. It's right looking where the Red Sea begins, right down in the south. But he says this, though we know a lot about Mocha, which is at the Gulf right there at the beginning of the Red Sea, there is nothing about the area near Jeddah. Nothing about that far north. Chiaro Jazaro. She quotes Chiaro Jazaro, the ancient Red Sea port of Agilis and the Eritrean coastal town. Previous investigations and museum collections put out by Oxford Press, the Archaeo Press in Oxford, put out in 2013. Who says this? Chiaro Jazaro says this: the Red Sea coast was characterized by a succession of well-protected bays, especially on the western side. Notice that. The western side, not the eastern side, but the western side, which is considered more suitable for navigation. In particular, the presence of springs originating from the ancient Wadian rivers in the northwestern coastal sector not only provided fresh water supplies for mariners, but also helped reduce the growth of coral reefs in correspondence to the bays. It continues. The Red Sea Basin is characterized by three main deep channels for navigation. Now, I'm going to put up another map. Now, this is a map, not a Google map, but it is a Google map, but it's one where you look at the topography, looking at from space, looking down topography, which shows then what is underwater. Take a look at this map, and you'll see there's the blue of the Red Sea. And it refers to three main deep channels. The central channel is the deepest. Here's the central channel, where the red arrow is. Can you see that? That's the deepest. Suitable for navigation by large modern ships. So today, that's where all the modern ships go, up and down the Red Sea. They follow that central channel. But there are two lateral channels which are parallel and separated from the coast by two sequences of coral reefs, and take small and medium ships. Let's look at these. And these are the golden, they follow the golden arrows. Those are what Chiaro Jazaro is talking about. These are the small, used for small and medium ships. Navigation in the Red Sea was conducted not far from the coast, so they usually follow those two golden channels there, always keeping sight of the mainland landmarks and such features as islands and coral reefs. Bays, scattered islands, and reefs played an important role in the Red Sea navigation, being used as stopping places during the night. The fact that navigation in the Red Sea during antiquity was mainly conducted at a short distance from the coast, and presumably along the two minor navigable channels, is also demonstrated by the fact that the first century sailor's manual, known as the Periplus Maris Erythraeae, I hope I've pronounced it right, gives particular emphasis to the description of the coastal landscape and of landmark which served for orientation to sailing boats. Note that a series of these, referring to the series of these well-protected bays, all along the Eritrean coast. Along the Eritrean coast. This had nothing to do with Arabia, nothing to do with the eastern coast. It was all on the western coast of the Red Sea. Why? Because that's where the navigation channels were. That's where the boats could go without going adrift. And that's where also the water was, the fresh water was. Goes on and says, on the other side, the northwest coast of the Red Sea, that's the further up north, has a number of underground freshwater sources not far from the coast, which may have guaranteed water supplies for boats and ships navigating along the coast, while the southern Red Sea coast, that's the southern part on the west, is very arid and with very few water sources. In this case, wells and cisterns carved into the bedrock all along the southwestern shore of the Red Sea and on the islands may have provided the necessary water supply for sailing boats and ships in this region since the earliest of times. The Eritrean coast south of Massawa is characterized by several protected bays that make for good anchorage. Now, what I want to do is I want to show you another map. I want to look at, and I want to show you what he's talking about. So we did some study, we did some research, and I looked at all the major ports. And I'm going to put these ports up there. And there are 5 major ports. And I'm going to put the dates there. Look at the dates. Let's start with the first one. So if you're coming in from the Arabian Sea, you're coming in from the east, you're coming up and you want to get up towards Egypt, you want to get up towards the Mediterranean world, you're coming across the Gulf, Arabian Sea, into the Gulf of Aden. And what's the first port you're going to have? Well, on the east side, we know it's Mocha. Mocha is there on the east side. But what's the first major port on the west side? That is known as Asab. That is in what is today Eritrea. Look at the date that it was first mentioned. The first reference we have for this city, this port city, is 246 BC. That's long before Islam. That's long before anything to do with the Muslim world. 246 BC. The Asab, the ancient name, was known as Arsinoe. Now let's look at a second city. This is known as Agilis, called Zula. It is also in Eritrea. And it is the port where Dr. Patricia Krohn, when she did her study on all this material, she found out the names that are coming up all the time on all the trading documents, all the way as far away over there in India in the east, all the names that were coming up were from Agilis. Agilis in Eritrea, that would be the second port. It is the earliest that we know about it is from 79 AD. So that's long. That is centuries before Islam even came into existence. And then the third port is Suakin, which is in the today's Sudan. Ptolemy writes about it in 170 AD, and he refers to it as the port of Good Hope. That's his port of Good Hope. Today it's called Suakin. And you can see it. There it is on the map. 170 AD, long before Islam. Okay, this is centuries before Islam. And then the next one is Berenice, which is in Egypt. Or Baranas. Baranis is another way you can pronounce it. Look at the date for that. 275 BC was when it was first referred to. That's the earliest that we can find a reference to it. So you can see these are old cities. The last one I'm going to put on the map is Safaga, also in Egypt, 282 BC, even earlier than Berenice. 5 different cities, all on the western coast of the Red Sea, all predating Islam, but what is interesting, they are after the time of Alexander the Great. So these would not have been great ports during the time of Alexander the Great. And that's why Iran of Soli, when he went around the Arabian Peninsula and went up the Red Sea, there were no navigable ports, because in the 4th century BC, these cities would not have existed. These cities only start to appear in the 3rd century and continue to appear in the 2nd, all the way up until the 2nd century AD, where they continue to appear even today. They're still there today. But take a look. Just look at that map again. Let's look at that map again. Look and see every one of these 5 cities is a day's sailing from each other. A day's sailing from each other. So it's obvious that the maritime route that Patricia Krohn talked about in her book, In Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, back in 1987, it's obvious that all of the trade, it was maritime, but it was not had anything to do with the eastern coast. It had nothing to do with Jeddah. Yanbu was much later, and that was only introduced as a place to go up to Yathrib. It is obvious that almost everything we're looking at is proving that everything about Mecca, everything about Jeddah, is only really being introduced from the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, up until the 15th century. 16th century. All of these traditions that refer to Adam and Eve there, we can pretty well throw out. These traditions that Alexander the Great went there, we can now throw out. We pretty well know that the maritime trade that went up the Red Sea had nothing to do with Arabia, had nothing to do with Jeddah, had nothing to do with Mecca, had everything to do with the Eritreans, had everything to do with the Egyptians and the Sudanese. What are today's Sudan? Back then they were completely different cultures. But today, if you look at the West Coast, and that trade followed a well-known and a direct coastal route right up the coast, as you can see, that went right up the west coast of the Red Sea. Thanks so much. I want to thank so much for lyth Mashni for trying to correct me. It's great to be corrected. This is called peer review, and this is how we learn. We go back and we jiggle things and we try to find out where we went wrong, and I was wrong on this because I thought that Wikipedia had the right sources. I realized that Wikipedia was using nothing more than material that was coming out of the Ministry of Tourism there in Saudi Arabia, and also the Ministry of the Hajj. I should have been careful on that. Thank you for correcting me. But in correcting me, can you find, we now pretty well know, even more so, that both Jeddah and Mecca had nothing to do with early trade. So the question still remains. Where then and why was Mecca finally chosen? Well, you can see. We now know that it was not chosen by a man named Muhammad. Muhammad never lived there. It was not even in existence when he was born in 570. There was no Mecca. There was no Mecca in 610 when he started supposedly receiving these revelations. There was no Mecca that he went from up to a place called Yathrib in 622. Yathrib did exist, but no place called Mecca. There was no Mecca when he came back and then supposedly took over the city in 630. In fact, we don't know of any place called Mecca in the 7th century, in the same century he lived. If you don't have Mecca, folks, what are you going to do with Muhammad's story? What are you going to do with all these traditions that talk about Mecca? What are you going to do with the Quran and its reference to the fact that Abraham supposedly was from there? Though it doesn't say the word Mecca, he was supposedly there and destroyed the idols in the Kaaba and was then thrown into a fiery pit. What are you going to do with the Quran? What are you going to do with Muhammad? What are you going to do with Islam? What we're showing is just by looking at history, getting the right type of history, going back and looking at the right sources, and trying to put it in a timeline, putting it on maps. That's why I put up so many maps here, so you can see Alexander the Great had nothing to do with Mecca, had nothing to do with that part of the world. Even those different expeditions he sent had nothing to do with Jeddah or Mecca. They didn't even know about the western coast, because at those times they were not large trading cities. But then by the 3rd century on, it was the western coast because of these navigation channels. That's why all the trade was on the west. That's where the water was, and that's where the bays were that could protect them. And those cities still exist today. They have different names, and they are now, some of them are in ruins. Others have grown up that are even bigger, like Port Sudan, which has nothing to do with ancient history. It's a much more modern city. But these ancient cities along the western coast of the Red Sea prove that nobody knew of Jeddah, nobody knew of Mecca. And without Mecca, without Jeddah, Islam's got a problem. You've got a real problem. Historical anachronism. Another big hole that you're falling into. God bless you. This is Jay. Over and out.